For 9 years, the deep under the lantern had said nothing. And at 04:11 on the morning the station's lease died, it said something. Soren Cade had the ears on, the battered analog cans he trusted over every screen on the deck. And what came up the probe cable was not noise. Noise had a texture he knew the way he knew his own pulse. This had structure. This was rising. The lantern was a buoyant reach contact station, a ribbed gas envelope habitat hanging alone in the upper atmosphere of the gas giant veil. The one warm light for 1,000 kilometers of banded cloud in any direction. It existed for exactly one purpose: to listen for the IU. The IU lived deeper than any human could go, sail forms kilometers wide in a pressure that would fold a person to paste, and they spoke, if spoke was the word, in rippling bioluminescence and shaped waves through the atmospheric medium. The lantern dropped instrumented probes into the readable band and waited for the deep to answer. In Soren's 3 years on station, it never had. In the station's 9, it never had. The Reach funded contact leases on the theory that the IU might one day say something worth the cost. The lantern had logged 9 years of nothing, and the Reach had finally read the ledger. Soren had stayed because the nothing was the most interesting nothing in the galaxy. The deck smelled of warm electronics and the faint sulfur the scrubbers never fully took out of the air, and the gas envelope groaned in the pressure the way it had groaned every shift since he arrived. And behind him the pattern wall was papered 3 deep in hand-sketch waveforms. His, all of them, ink curled at the edges. He drew the EU's signals by hand, because his hand noticed things the sanction analysis kit averaged away. The kit was built to recognize. The hand was built to wonder. 9 years of recordings, and Soren had spent 3 of them convinced there was structure in the noise that the recognizer was throwing out, and unable to prove it to anyone who mattered. Because I can feel a shape in it was not a sentence the Reach knew how to fund. Nadia Brandt had told the crew the night before, because Nadia did not let people read bad news off a board.
Lease is pulled. 60 days. They'll place everyone. I made them put that in writing before I'd sign it. Vale goes back to being a gas giant nobody listens to.
9 years isn't long. For them. The IU answer probes years after the probe stops transmitting. We might be a question they haven't gotten to yet.
I know, Soren. I put that in the lease defense 4 times. The Reach doesn't fund might be a question they haven't gotten to yet. It funds contact. We don't have contact. We have a wall of your drawings and a very honest log.
She was not unkind about the wall of drawings. That was the thing. Nadia had defended his ear listening and his hand sketches to auditors who wanted screens and metrics year after year, and she had run out of road, and she knew it, and she had made her peace with it the way she made peace with everything. Out loud, dry, and once. He had gone back to his shift after that because there was nothing else to do with the news. You did not stop listening to the deep just because someone in an office 100 light years away had decided the deep was not worth a budget line. The EU did not know about budget lines. The EU, if the Sewell archives were to be believed, had been here before the Accord, before the Charn's 9,000 years, possibly before anything else in the galaxy had a word for itself. And they had watched every species that ever tried to talk to them give up, one funding cycle at a time. Soren had always found that less depressing than it sounded. It meant the IU were patient with exactly the thing humans were worst at. It meant the conversation was still open on their side even when it closed on ours, which was the situation at a 4:11 when the deep started rising and Soren Cade had the ears on. He read the rise off the board and off the ears at once, and they did not agree, and that was the first wonderful thing. The board's catalog tagger, the Sewell-sold interaction kit that recognized a small set of U motifs and called everything else unstructured, was tagging the rise as noise. Soren's ears said otherwise. There was a shape in it, a slow, vast, recurring shape, swelling up the probe cable from somewhere far below the readable band. He pulled the deep scan, and there at a depth the station had never once registered an EU rising to, was a fragment of the halo ascending. Nadia was back on the deck inside 2 minutes, glasses down off her head and onto her nose.
Tell me that's what I think it is.
Emergence event. a fragment of the halo rising into the readable band. The Sewell catalog says these happen maybe once a decade per gas giant. We've never logged one. It's rising now.
The catalog called them emergence events, the way a person might call a once-in-a-life storm weather. Technically accurate and entirely inadequate. Most of the time, the EU stayed deep, kilometers down, where the pressure held their vast membranes and where no probe the lantern carried could read them clearly. The readable band was a thin, habitable seam of the atmosphere, the same seam that held the station up. For an EU to rise into it, for a fragment of the halo to climb to a depth where a human instrument could hear it plainly, took some reason the EU had and did not share. A disturbance. A question the deep decided was worth surfacing for. Nobody knew which. The Sewell sold 3 theories and were honest that none of them predicted anything.
How long's the window?
Hours, if we're lucky. And we are not lucky because there's a pressure front coming up under it.
He put the front on the board for her. A wall of weather climbing the atmosphere, the kind of churn that would close the readable band like a hand closing on a candle. When the front reached their depth, the medium would go turbulent and the band would be unreadable for days. The fragment would sink back. The window was not hours, the window was about 90 minutes.
90 minutes to make contact on a lease that's already dead. Run the catalog. Run all of it.
They ran the catalog. This was the part Soren would think about later, that they did it right first. The Sewell sold catalog was the sanctioned way to speak to an EU. A library of acoustic shapes, sound puzzles, pressure patterns the Sewell had accumulated over thousands of years of trade, each one a thing you could drop into a gas giant that an EU might answer. The station's emitter package broadcast them one after another into the readable band. The greeting shapes, the query shapes, the cataloged openings older species had used for ages. The fragment rose and shaped its slow light and did not answer a single one.
It's not deaf. Look, every time we send, the pattern hitches. It hears us. It's choosing not to answer.
Maybe the catalog's wrong. The Sewell always said it works differently than advertised.
No, the catalog's not wrong. It's all questions. Every shape in it is something we want. Greet, query, request, open. Nobody ever sells the IU a shape that just means I heard you. Because that's not a question. There's nothing to trade for it.
It was the most obvious thing in the world once he'd said it, and it had taken him 9 years of recordings and a dying lease to see it. The Sewell had built the contact catalog the way the Sewell built everything, as a market. You bought shapes that got you something, information, acknowledgement, a response you could log and sell. Thousands of years of the galaxy species walking up to the oldest mind alive and in effect asking it for things. And the IU, who had no hurry and no market and no reason on earth to answer a stranger's demand, had mostly declined to be transacted with. Soren had a wall of 9 years nothing that was read this way, not nothing at all. It was 9 years of the deep deciding the questions weren't worth the rising. He was talking fast now, the way he talked when the thing was actually happening, and then he stopped talking entirely, the way he went quiet when it was. He pulled the ears back on. He listened to the fragment's own pattern, the slow, vast, recurring shape that had come up the cable at 0411, and he did not reach for the catalog. He reached for the fragment's own shape and started to copy it out by hand. The idea was simple, and the hardware was the problem. He wanted to send the fragment its own pattern back, not a catalog shape, not a question. Just the thing it was already saying, return to it. The pressure medium equivalent of looking someone in the eye and repeating carefully the last thing they said so they know you were listening. No species sold that because you could not charge for it. The Sewell catalog had 1,000 ways to ask and not one way to simply answer, yes, I hear you. But the sanctioned emitter package could only broadcast catalog shapes. It was built to play the library. It physically could not shape a freehand pattern Soren sketched off the ears 90 seconds ago. The emitter was a closed instrument. The Sewell had built it that way on purpose. You bought the catalog, you played the catalog.
Nadia, the drop probes, the pressure sensors on the probes. They're transducers, right? A diaphragm that moves when the medium pushes on it.
They're microphones, Soren, for pressure. That's the whole probe.
A microphone and a speaker are the same thing run backwards. You drive the diaphragm instead of letting the medium drive it, and it pushes the medium instead of listening to it. I can run a probe sensor as an emitter, off the boards by hand, any shape I want. It'll push a real pressure wave into the band.
You'll cook it. Those diaphragms aren't built to be driven. You drive it hard enough to make a wave the fragment can feel, you burn the sensor out. That's a probe, Soren. We have 4 left and a dead lease.
We have a dead lease and 90 minutes and a thing that rises once a decade, and it's hitching every time we talk. 1 probe. Let me spend 1 probe saying I heard you in its own words. If I'm wrong, we're out a probe on a station that closes in 60 days.
Nadia looked at the weatherboard. The front was climbing.
Log the clause you're breaking. I'm not having the audit say I didn't make you log it.
Already logging it.
It took him 40 of his 90 minutes to splice a probe sensor into the emitter line and rig a way to drive it off a hand controller instead of the catalog. The work was ugly. A pressure sensor was a membrane stretched over a coil. Let the medium push the membrane, and you read a signal. Push current through the coil, and the membrane pushed the medium back. That was all a speaker was. That was all a microphone was. The Sewell had simply never built the contact gear to do both, because both was not a product. Soren bridged the sensor's coil to the spare emitter driver with a length of patch cable and a connector he filed down with a multi-tool, and he gave himself a hand controller, a single sliding contact, so he could shape a wave by feel instead of by library. He cooked 1 diaphragm in testing, just learning how hard he could push before it tore. The membrane was built to flex a hair's width under a passing wave, not to be slammed back and forth hard enough to make a wave of its own. Drive it too hard and it ripped like wet paper. That left 3 probes and 1 working rig, and a very clear sense of how little room he had between too quiet for the deep to feel and torn.
You've got maybe 1 good run in that before the diaphragm goes. You know that.
I know that. So I'd better say something worth saying the first time.
He lowered the rigged probe into the readable band on the tether, set the ears on, and played the fragment its own pattern, by hand, off his sketch. The slow, vast recurring shape returned. Not a question. Just the thing it was already saying, said back carefully, so it would know he had been listening. Then the part nobody could rig around. He waited. The waiting was the worst engineering problem of all, because there was no engineering in it. The EU did not have a hurry mechanism. The species file said responses could arrive years after a probe went dark. Soren watched the band and the weather front race each other and tried not to count, and counted anyway. Nadia stood beside him and did not say anything useful, which was the useful thing to do. The front climbed, the fragment held in the readable band, its great translucent membrane shaping slow light below them, neither answering nor leaving. The EU did not have a hurry mechanism. Responses came over hours, days, sometimes years. He had 90 minutes minus 50 in a front climbing the sky, and he had just sent the most patient species in the galaxy a thing it had to decide was worth answering, and there was nothing to do but watch the band and the weather race each other. The fragment answered in 11 minutes. Soren would never be able to explain to the Reach or to anyone what 11 minutes of waiting felt like with a weather front eating your window, except that when the answer came, it came not as a hitch but as a flood. The board's deep teal bloom doubled and doubled again. The fragment, which had rebuffed a 1,000-year-old catalog of polished questions all morning, had heard its own shape come back to it from the small warm light in the high band, and it had decided that was worth answering. Beside him, Nadia took her glasses off, which was the only thing he ever saw rattle her. In the ears, the response was not a sound so much as a pressure he felt in his teeth and his sternum, the medium itself moving, shaped, deliberate, vast. He had spent 3 years straining to hear structure and noise and arguing with a recognizer that threw it away. And here was structure so dense and so intentional that the argument was simply over. There was a mind down there. It had heard him. The wall of 9 years, nothing behind him, had just become the prologue to a single yes. What it said, no human could read. That was the rule of the U, and the rule held. The patterns were receivable, recordable, real, and not translatable to language in any clean way. The narrator of Soren's own life could only say what he saw. The rhythm broke once, twice, then steadied into the shape he had sent it, and built on it and gave it back changed. His pattern with something added, the way you answer a repeated word by saying it back and then saying the next one. And the catalog tagger, the Sool kit that almost never fired. It put up 2 tags. 2 out of a response that contained more structure than the station had recorded in 9 years. The Sool had sold the lantern a recognizer for a small set of motifs other species had, over millennia, half learned to flag, and 2 of them lit. The first the catalog lost, the ones who shaped, a predecessor referent, the makers, the gone. The second the catalog lost, withdrawn, kept, gone to silence. The fragment had answered Soren's "I heard you" by saying back, in the only fragments any species had ever learned to flag, something about the ones who made everything, and something about silence that was kept.
It's talking about the predecessors. I said "I hear you" and it answered about the makers. And about Nadia, the second tag, kept silence. It's the same word the VASC use for places the old gear goes quiet. I've read that report. Kept.
You're reading 2 tags out of a flood you can't translate, Soren. Don't build a temple on 2 tags.
I'm not building anything. I'm recording everything. Whatever it is, it's the first thing this deep has ever said to anyone. And it said it back to its own voice, not to a Sool question.
The probe chose that moment to die. He had been driving the rigged diaphragm past every limit it had for almost an hour to keep his side of the conversation alive, and it tore. The deep teal outgoing trace went flat, the rig's telltale died, and the one channel by which a human had been speaking to the deep in the deep's own shape went silent. He had nothing left to send. He had the catalog which it would not answer, and a dead rig, and a front climbing the sky. He played the catalog's listening shape anyway, the closest thing to "I'm still here" the sanctioned library had. Knowing it was the wrong shape, knowing the fragment had only ever answered its own voice and never the Sool's. The fragment held a moment at the readable band, its patterning slowed. The halo drifted up around it, plural, never one, the way the EU were always never one. And then the front reached their depth, and the medium went to churn, and the band closed like a hand closing on a candle, and the fragment sank back into the deep without answering the catalog. Because the catalog had never been its own voice, and the only voice that had been was lying dead and smoking on the console under Soren Cade's stilled hand. The deck was very quiet after. The board held the recording, the whole flood of it, his pattern returned and built upon, the 2 lit tags burning over it.
That's contact. Recorded, time-stamped, witnessed. The first on this lease. I'm sending it up the chain inside the hour, and I'm going to enjoy watching the Reach explain why it pulled a lease the week before the Deep finally said something.
It might not save the station.
It might not, but it's true, and they can't unhear it, and I've learned to take that as a win out here. Log your claws, Soren. All of them.
She left to wake the relay and pick a fight with the Reach. Soren stayed on the deck with the recording and the dead rig and the ears around his neck. He played it again. The flood, his pattern returned, the build, the 2 tags, the ones who shaped, kept silence. He had set out to say nothing but "I hear you." The one thing the catalog could not sell, the one thing no older species bothered to send because there was no trade in it, and the oldest intelligence in the galaxy, which had ignored 1,000 years of polished questions all morning, had heard itself come back from a small human light and chosen, for 11 minutes, to answer. It had not answered a question. There had been no question. It had simply, in the only fragments anyone could flag, told him about the makers and about a silence that was kept. He did the only thing left to do. He rigged the catalog's listening shape one more time on the sanctioned emitter and sent it down into the churn. "I'm still here," knowing it was the wrong voice, knowing the band was closed. He put the ears on and waited for an answer he knew was not coming, because the only voice that could have carried it was the one he had burned out. And because the deep had gone back to being a gas giant nobody listened to. Nothing came back. He kept listening anyway. That was the job. That had always been the job. And now at last there was something in the silence worth straining to hear.